Hi, my name is Drew Tonneson. I work for engineering at Dell, and I focus on VMware with PowerMax and PowerFlex. Today I'm going to talk to you about the new feature that's in the SRDF SRA, which allows you to set up a DR situation with MetroDR, or also known as SmartDR. So the current functionality that we have before the new release is that you can set up a single async leg off of a Metro pair, so off of the R1. So in essence, you're doing a concurrent configuration. And the problem with that, of course, is that if you lose the R1, you can't do anything but fail over to the DR site with SRM. Otherwise, you can choose to continue to run on the R2, but since the R2 is not replicating to the DR site, if you stick to the R2, you've basically lost your DR site because it's not going to be up to date. So what MetroDR does is, since both the R1 and the R2 have links to the DR, either one is replicating to it to keep it in sync. And the way that works is it's not a simultaneous transfer of data from both sides. Instead, what it is the R1 starts doing the transfer. If anything happens to the R1, then the data transfer then goes from the R2 over to the DR site. Now, the SRA, unable to really do anything for you in the previous configuration of just a single leg, the way that you can do things now is you can say, okay, I'm going to set it up so I'm going to do a uniform Metro configuration, meaning I'm going to present the R1 and the R2 both to the same vCenter, right? And if there happens to be a failure of the R1, I'm going to be able to reconfigure SRM so that it's using the R2 devices on the primary site, and those devices are already, because of how the array is handling it, they're already replicating down to the DR site. So you have the ability then to basically continue operating without having to fail over until the R2 fails, and then you'd have to fail over. So I'm going to walk through it here because it's a little more complicated than screenshots really do justice, so it's easier just to show you. So let's take a look at the environment. I have 1473 as my Metro R1, 1592 is my Metro R2, and 341 is the DR site. The easiest way to look at it is to come out where we have a nice GUI interface for the MetroDR. And you can see I only have one environment set up just so it's not confusing, MetroDR_SRA. The details here will show me a graphical view where I can look at my arrays, the DR site, and if I want to look at the individual pairs, I can do that too for my Metro, for my DR, right? MetroDR is quite simple to configure because you can just use the wizard. So you select a storage group and just walk through the wizard and it'll do it all for you. It makes it quite easy. Now, the environment out here, so here I have, this is my R1 site, my R1 vCenter, my R1 as I call it, but this is my vCenter that's going to see both the R1 and the R2, right? So this environment essentially is my protection site for SRM, and I also have a DR site for SRM. Now remember, SRM is a two-site solution, so no matter what the replication is on the back end, even though we do three-site and all sorts of configurations, from an SRM perspective, there's only two sites, right? So I can't have two vCenters, one that sees the R1, one that sees the R2, and then see a third vCenter that sees the DR. It doesn't work that way. So what I have to do is I have to present both arrays to this environment here. So I've created two data stores with a single VM on each for the MetroDR site, right? And if I look at my device backing here, right, it's a 100 gig device on each, and then the connectivity and the multipathing. So here I'm actually going to have 4 paths, right? So 2 of these paths go to R1, 2 of these paths go to the R2. right? Now, the idea behind what's called a uniform configuration is that since the single ESXi host sees devices from both arrays, if you lose an array or connectivity to the array, everything continues to function, right? Two of these paths would just go dead, but the other two would continue to function, so you still have access to them. Uniform configurations generally, outside of certain configurations like this one, we generally don't recommend them because there's all sorts of latency issues to consider and things like that. And certainly if your sites are quite far apart, on the edge of functionality for Metro, it's not a great idea to uniform because of the latency issues. However, when they're very close together, in this case, they're in the same data center, a lot of customers run that way, or two buildings next to each other, then uniform is a pretty safe configuration. And for MetroDR with SRA, it's really the only way to configure that makes sense. Otherwise, you're having to do a lot of extra work if there's a failure on the R1. You can still reconfigure things to use the R2. It just becomes more difficult. So all this is set up. I have also configured two solutions enabler that I'm going to tell the SRA about. Okay, so this is my protection site. And the key here about how this works is that the protection site, right, my solutions enabler, has to see both Metro arrays as local, right? And it should have the MetroDR as remote. This is key because if they're not both local, then I won't have access to them as available pairings when we do SRM, and I'll show you how that's going to work. So set these two as local. On your DR site, however, right, you're going to have the opposite. The local is only going to be the DR, and then both of your metros are going to be remote, right? So this is the way it looks for, whether you're doing 3-site, 2-site, whatever. Remember, you always have at least one local, one remote, one local, one remote. In this case, we have two because we're using a metro. So let's jump over to SRM. Okay, so here you can see I have my correct version of the SRA installed, 10.1. All the requirements you've already read through in the blog. The nice thing about the feature is it's not relegated to current software release on the array, right? So you're not going to have to buy a new array to get it. All the functionality is going to be contained inside of the SRA and Solutions Enabler. So as long as you have the latest Solutions Enabler and the latest SRA, you can go pretty far back in the operating system on the array, and this is still supported. So let's add array pairs here. So we choose our SRDF SRA, and we'll give it a protection site. Just call it protection MetroDR, and give it our IPs, 232 and 235, the two I just showed you. And now it's going to do its discovery, and then we'll do the other site for the DR. And there's our site, so we'll just call this one MetroDR, DR, opposite IPs here, 235, 232, and put those in. So it's going to come out, it'll discover the pairs, and here's where you're going to see something a little bit different. Okay, now notice here, SRA has recognized, well, I should say it's really SRM at this point, but the SRA has recognized that we have two array pair configurations available to us, right? Because of the way that we've set up the local arrays for Metro versus the DR, right? So 1592, 1473, both going to 341. Now, we could choose to enable both of these and continue through. I don't like to do it that way because when you create the protection group, you got to remember which one you want to create the protection group on. You want to make sure you have the R1. The best bet then is to say, okay, well, I know 1473 is the R1, so I want to unclick that and just use this one, right? This pairing will always be available to us, ready to be enabled. We can enable this one later, which we will, but right now we just want the one, and then have it go out and do the discovery. Right, so it's going to go out and do the discovery of the pairs. And check our recent tasks. Looks like it's done. So if I highlight this one, okay, it has found my metro pairs, 1 and 2, right? So I can now come out and say, okay, you found my particular pairs, and I'm going to create a protection group. The other thing, as I scroll over, one of the requirements that doesn't exist for a MetroDR config is a composite device group, right? So in order to run any sort of test capability, just the test failover, you have to have a consistency group or a device group with the SRA. It's just how it works. With MetroDR, because of the way it works, we don't require that. It wouldn't work right. It would just be a mess. So instead, what the SRA does is, if this looks familiar, MetroDR_SRA, that was the name of our Metro environment here. So what happens is that the SRA uses that environment name as the consistency group. So that we don't have to worry about that, but now, of course, we know it was discovered successfully because that's there. So come out to the protection group. So we'll create a new protection group in my PowerMax folder, and we'll just call this MetroDR, PG, pop through, and our pairs. Now, see, this is where I was talking about we're going to see both of these, right? But this already tells me it's not the right one because I didn't enable it to begin with, which was good. So I know I'm choosing the correct one. If I had enabled that one, there's nothing here telling me which one to pick. And SRM doesn't care because they're both enabled and they're both going to be able to see the pairs. So we don't want to select the wrong one. So we select that one. We grab our pairs here. Yes, add it to our protection group. Let's create a new recovery plan, which we'll call MetroDR RP. Click through, and there's our protection group. And our recovery plan, if we come over here and look at that, here's my virtual machines available to me. So in this environment, we'd be all set now to run a test failover or run a failover. Everything's good. So now we come to the point where, and there's no point in running a test because you guys have seen that enough. So now it comes to the point, okay, let's say I'm operating normally in my environment and I run into a situation where I lose the R1. So let's go lose the R1. So let's come out to our environment here. Let's do a suspend, and we'll suspend the Metro R1. So we're going to keep the R2, okay? So let's run that now. So we're going to stop the replication on the R1. So you can see now it's all upset here. I've got statuses that are bad and so here. So now you can see there's no more replication going between here, right? If I come out into my environment here, right? So looking at here, my pathing are dead now, right? To that, so now I know that particular LUN is the one's going to the 1473, the R1, and I still have active, so my VMs are fine because I still have active paths, but the other ones are dead. Now, coming back out here, right, so if I come out and look at my array pairs, right, and do this, right, so let's run a discover devices here from 1473 to 341. So here we're now unknown, right? Because our R1 is down. So now we're stuck, right? Because our protection group and our recovery plan are no longer going to work because it's not going to be proper. Okay, so what do we do? Okay, so let's start where we need to start. Let's get rid of the recovery plan, right? We can't use this recovery plan because it's tied to this protection group, which we can't use. So we remove the recovery plan, remove the protection group. Okay, so go back to our site pairs, right? And we look at our array pairs and go, okay, 1473 is not good anymore, but my R2, which is 1592 to 341, let's go enable that pair, okay? And let's come back to this one and disable it since we know it's no good. So now I have this active pair, and lo and behold, it has found my group, right? Because it's the same thing. It's going to, it's the R2 connection down to the DR. So now I can say, okay, now I'm going to come out to my area here, my protection area here, and let's create a new group, which is the same as the other group, except now we're going to use the other pair. There they are. Here we go. Create a new recovery plan. And as I like to say, Bob's your uncle there. So we now have our recovery plan back. We are protected because we've reconfigured this. It took all of a minute to go through and set it back up. But it enables us to continue to operate on the R2, knowing it's replicating to the DR site. And if we have a failure of any site, of any type, we're going to be able to fail over to the active site at the DR location. So that's how the new functionality works in the SRA. So if you have this configuration, set it up this way, and it'll enable you to have much better resiliency if you lose the R1, right? I should mention, if you lose the R2 first instead of the R1, you obviously don't have to do anything because you've configured with the R1. Also, could you have started by configuring the R2 instead of the R1? No, that wouldn't be a best practice. I mean, it'll let you do it, but you shouldn't do that. Configure with the R1, change it to the R2 if there's an issue. Thanks for listening.